We should be live. Hey everybody, I'm Nick from Kinetic, and before we jump in, I'm just going to give a quick introduction to this series. So, over the past few years, like we've seen brokers and tech companies and other transportation providers incorporate more marketing into their business. That being said, it's still pretty new to this space, so the question becomes like, where do you go to learn more about marketing and everything goes along with it? Like, if you don't have the background, how do you understand what to do? So at Kinetic, one of our, am I muted?
I can hear you.
Yep.
Oh, sorry, I got a message I was muted. Anyway, that's good. So anyway, at Kinetic, one of our overarching principles is just industry education. So we started up the logistics and marketing to bring together experts, talk about how marketing can be used in the industry. And each episode, we cover a specific topic. Today's topic, fundraising and investing. We got great guests. Let's do a couple of quick intros. Charley, do you want to kick things off?
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Thanks for having me. My name is Charley Dehoney. I'm the Vice President of ZEBOX America. ZEBOX is a multi-corporate accelerator founded by Rodolphe Sade, the chairman of CMA CGM Group, really with the vision of connecting innovative startups to large players in the industry to drive innovation inside of these large corporations. So I've got this summer is my 19th year in supply chain and logistics. I've done everything from parcel to truck brokerage to international to global trade, and now really focused on corporate innovation. I spent the last 4 or 5 years doing a fair amount of angel investing and startup advising. So really excited for the topic today and excited to be here with my good friend Anshu.
Yeah, you've got a ton of experience. I'm looking forward to learning some stuff. Anshu, you want to do a quick intro?
Yeah, it's great to see you both and great to see you, Charley. So I am a co-founder and CEO at Leaf Logistics, just a little over 5-year-old company trying to change the way that transportation is bought and sold, small mission. But along the course of about 18, 19 years of my journey prior to starting Leaf, I'd helped shippers, carriers, brokers just engage in the business of buying and selling freight for, in multitudes of industries, but also in various geographies. And the problem always persisted where it was very transactional, very much focused on a load at a time. We're trying to change that. And so looking forward to continuing on that journey, but also along the way, we've had the chance to work with amazing investors. I'm happy to dig into at least the little bit of that world that I've learned along the last 5 years.
Perfect. All right. I'm looking forward to hearing from both of you guys on this. And just to reiterate, today's topic is marketing and fundraising. We always talk about how much money has been pouring into the space over the past several years. And today we're going to talk about the role that marketing plays in that process. And I know both of you guys have a ton of experience with startups and investing. So this should be a great conversation. And I'm going to set the stage with just a really broad question. And I'll kick it off with Charley first. How do startups use marketing to attract investors? Do they? Is that part of the process?
So I wish I could tell you that there's a really well-developed strategy or playbook that you can execute on that. I think many startups misuse the term marketing to begin with. I think, there's certain elements of direct sales that need to be supported by marketing. And so my message for startups, first and foremost, is any dollars you invest into marketing, make sure that those dollars can be recycled into different areas. So probably the best example of this is your initial pitch deck, your presentation deck. Most startups, are willing to spend a little bit of money to develop a good presentation. And what I always encourage people to do is if you spent money on that presentation to show to investors to help you get the capital that you need to launch your project, and then once your project is launched, you need a separate presentation deck to go sell your product. This is the biggest mistake that I see startups make, is they develop one pitch, one presentation, and they share the same presentation or the same pitch to a venture capitalist, to a prospective customer, to a employee they're trying to recruit, or their mother-in-law at Thanksgiving dinner. So I always encourage people to take that initial presentation deck that helped you raise your pre-seed round or your friends and family round, and then adapt that presentation So it's well suited to tell the story of the value that you create to your customers, and then make sure it's not the exact same pitch, because customers, Anshu will back me up on this, they're experts at purchasing transportation or purchasing solutions. They're not experts at making VC investment decisions. So if you tell them the same story, you're going to be leaving a lot of value on the table. So the number one thing I see startups invest in marketing is presentation. And then I think beyond that, the website is critically important to make sure that when you're successful at urging somebody to come to your website, you need to make sure that it's professionally laid out and it tells a good story. This is another common mistake that I see startups make, is they'll just put a landing page out there, or maybe they'll use the same website, the same front end of their website for the first 2 or 3 years of their journey. And if there's anything you can do beyond developing a great presentation and marketing collateral, it's having a website that tells an effective story, because whether it's an investor or it's a customer or it's a prospective employee, et cetera, all of these folks are going to go to your website. And if your website is leaving out messaging that's critical to your mission, you're leaving value on the table. So the answer is yes, Nick. Startups absolutely do marketing. Unfortunately, very few of them do it well, but shouldn't be a surprise, because none of us took a marketing for startups course in high school or college. So these are things that need to be learned. And frankly, it's great that there's companies like Kinetic and there's other solid agencies out there that understand our space and they understand our audiences. And frankly, I've learned most of what I know about marketing from guys like you and other people in the industry.
Yeah, and I'm unfortunately missing my marketing counterpart today, Zach, so I'm winging it to a degree there. But yeah, I completely agree with that. We talk a lot at Kinetic about tailoring your messaging to like individual prospects, and it sounds very similar. Anshu, like what's your take on the same question there?
Yeah, let me just double down on what Charlie said around understanding your audience and speaking to them. I mean, in some ways, I think in the early stages, a startup, marketing means communications and messaging, and understanding what the person on the other side of the table is looking for, why they took this time to have this conversation. It's a precious commodity for all of us, right? Obviously, the startups are grinding, but the other person on the other side of the table is trying to figure out why they're in this discussion in the first place. So if you haven't told them what's in it for them in a very precise way, yeah, they may be intellectually curious about the fundraising process. Like some customers are kind of curious what's going on in this venture world, but that's not their day job. Their day job, to Charlie's point, is to figure out how to solve the transportation needs for their company. And not only are they focused on doing their job well, if they do it better and differently, they can bring more value to, the folks that they work with. Making that clear, as opposed to talking about, some broader message around how we've raised money, or even frankly, the technology and the way that we apply it, while that might be interesting to folks at Leaf, it's not as relevant for the person on the other side of the table. So tailoring that message and getting the communication part of that right, understanding and knowing your audience, that's the name of the game.
So one thing that you actually both brought up a little bit, Charlie, you talked about like the website telling a good story. Can you tell me more about what you mean by that? Like what should this story be? Oh, you're muted.
Did it to myself. The story should be very tailored towards the audience that you're trying to attract. So I think the best websites from a buyer's perspective, give them a little bit of a mirror to look into. So what that means when I say that is, if you are a purchasing person or somebody in the technology or IT group that's looking at a technology driven solution, or maybe in procurement or transportation, you're looking at a new provider to potentially help you move your goods. When you go to these companies' websites, what you're looking for is something you can relate to. So I think the best stories you can tell on your website are use cases, specifically defining the types of customers that you serve, and very directly tying why your solution was purpose built for those types of companies. So when you go back to the mirror analogy, if I land on a website and I see a very, very well-defined use case, or a case study about a particular experience that a customer had with this service provider, if certain elements of that use case or that case study make me feel like they're very similar to me, I'm much more likely to lean into that solution as a potential option, because when I got to that website, there's language and industry information that resonates with me and my business. So on your website, the more general your website is, the least likely it is to drive conversions in the form of new customers, new investors, or new employees joining your organization, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting in terms of, like, you just want to find that niche audience and do everything you can to appeal to them and kind of have them spread the word from there. If I'm parroting that back somewhat correctly. Am I? Maybe.
I think that's spot on. I'm thinking less about the, like, turning your prospect into an evangelist. I'm thinking more about the best businesses are built on niches, right? And, like, I love the phrase niches make riches, because when you find a customer, I learned this early in my career at Worldwide Express. Like, when I went to basic sales training, people told me, go cold call every car dealership in your territory very first. Why? Because in 2003, car dealerships still overnight shipped a lot of contracts whenever they would do a deal. So what I got good at early in my career was walking into one car dealership and telling them the story about how I helped the car dealership down the street, who they already know of. They drive past it every day. Some of their former employees probably work over there and vice versa. So creating that kind of community around your solution is really incumbent on you as the growth person or the marketer to make sure that when I'm talking to Nick at Kinetic, he feels like I'm uniquely suited to solve his problem based on the type of business or the industry that he's in. And I'm not saying that you can only have one niche. In fact, the best businesses are built on a bunch of different niches. But when you get to that website, if you're leaving any of those niches out, then the likelihood of the person from that group, finding that resonation is going to be lower.
Okay. Now we've talked about the website and pitch decks, kind of tailoring those to different audiences. Do you find that social media plays any sort of a role in this in terms of reaching investors?
I think, broadly speaking, a good portion of what I have in my career and the successes that I found on my journey comes from social media. So, I'm from the age, older than you, Nick, where, I was around when LinkedIn first came out. And when LinkedIn first hit the scene, it was the only social media platform out there. Like, MySpace was kind of crumbling. Facebook hadn't been invented yet. But for those of us in sales and growth, it was a gold mine of opportunity to find new leads and new relationships. And really what that's cascaded to now is there's communities or pockets of people that are like-minded that are very findable on LinkedIn. And for me, Twitter is another huge area where I find a lot of my valuable connections. Nick, that was first how I became aware of you and what you were doing. I knew your partner, Ryan, from, past lives. But once I saw you putting out content and updates about what you were building at Kinetic, instantly it resonated with me. And so I think social media is where we can go to find like-mindedness and build community around the areas of interest that we all share.
Yeah. And like you mentioned, we at Kinetic clearly lean into that heavily and found a lot of success with it. Anshu, I'd love to get your perspective on that. How does social media play a role in terms of attracting investors or any area of marketing, really?
Yeah, so I think in two ways. One is, in some ways you can kind of think of investors as a kind of customer. They're trying to understand your problem, your perspective, your solution, and why it could be a big business. Otherwise, what's in it for them? And so you kind of need to be where your customers are, like in any kind of sales opportunity. And, one thing that I've certainly learned about investors is they do their homework. They're infinitely curious. They're out there like looking at all the sources of information that are available to them. They're active on social media. So if that's where your customers are, in some ways, you kind of have to be there to engage in the dialogue. Secondly, because they do consume a lot of information, and they have to in their line of work, they have to scan pretty broadly to understand all the things that are going on to place their few chips on the companies that they think will make a real difference. It's a challenge for them to kind of consume all that information in digestible formats and then be able to tell the difference between good ideas and great ideas. And so using social media to cut through some of that noise and frankly, the inherent complexity in our space, in transportation and logistics more broadly, there is a lot of complexity. Very smart people do this job very, very well and have done it for a long time. There's a lot going on. To brain dump all of that onto an unsuspecting investor is probably a good recipe for getting them kind of running, screaming for the hills. But social media does a really good job just in terms of its own format in distilling down some essential perspectives and dropping them into investors in bite-sized chunks so they can actually consume them and develop their own thesis. At the end of the day, investors don't want to be led down a path, just like your prospective customers don't want to be led down a path. They want to make their own decisions, and they want to see what they're looking for and how it aligns with their thesis. They need that information packaged up in a way that social media does a pretty good job at, used well. There is a lot of noise, though, to be fair. Social media does have a lot of stuff to sift through, not done well.
There is, but it's funny how it's like compared to the writing that you would do in like college or high school, it almost requires you to be more concise. And I think that's a really interesting aspect of social media personally, being able to like turn something that used to be like a multi-page like essay or whatever you were writing and distill it into just like a quick paragraph that people can understand on LinkedIn or even shorter on Twitter. I don't know how people do Twitter. I'm still working on that. But Anshu, you mentioned a couple things that I have a follow-up question on. So talking about like be where your customers are. So where are investors? I mean, we talked about social media, but are there other places to find them? And then once you figure that out, how do you stand out? Are there any best practices or tips you can suggest there?
So I guess a couple of things, just appreciating and empathizing a bit with the challenge the investor has of kind of scanning the whole universe of information out there and trying to figure out signal from noise. That's a pretty tough ask. And so a lot of investors use what we do in the industry. They lean on people that they know and trust to kind of help them sift through some of that noise. So those connections, LinkedIn, absolutely transformed how people sell. But if you haven't done the work today to kind of understand your connections to the person you want to talk to, then frankly, you're not prepared. And I think investors kind of think about it that way too. They're looking for proof points, indications, referrals, and the strength of those connections matter disproportionately to the best sort of content you could put in front of them. And so doing the work to kind of knit together content with how that message gets delivered by who the messenger is important. The other thing I'd say is that investors, while they have to do their homework and kind of develop their own perspective, they have to synthesize a lot of information that they don't have the benefit of decades of experience kind of compiling. So they're going to be looking for subject matter expertise, frankly, just to get smarter on the topic. One of the legendary investors I had a chance to get prepared for a couple of rounds ago, honestly, I found over 200 pages of published content he had generated himself, just doing the work, right? And that's the kind of informed investor who's really interested in understanding the problem that frankly we want to be working with to build a business that we don't have all the answers for yet either, right? So it's someone who really wants to consume that content is going to be asking for information. And one of the best tools that we found tactically is these folks are looking for resources and places where they can do their own homework. Well, yes, anything I put in front of them will have its own point of view, but they're not expecting anything different. They're going to do their work around any of the sources we indicate, but help them at least get the ball rolling, give them a few pieces of information that allow them to just get some of their fact base established.
I like that. I think that's a really good take on it. Charley, because I think it's an interesting question. I'll ask you too, but where do you find investors Like where do they hang out, and how do you stand out if you're looking for fundraising?
So investors generally hang out in communities, just like, all of us, right? Before we joined, before when we were waiting, I was talking about, my real passion is coaching kids sports. And so on social media, my social media feeds are a nice mix of travel baseball and logistics technology. And inside of these communities, if you break them down, to Anshu's point, like the quality of connections that you can demonstrate to an investor instantly adds credibility. So the number one way you can get connected to an investor is by building a relationship with founders that they know and trust. If I were to start a company tomorrow, before I ever sent a cold email to an investor, I would reach out to guys like Anshu and other founders that I know and say, hey, I was doing my research. To Anshu's point, I saw that this guy has a really interesting perspective on these particular topics. They're all relevant to my project. Do you know this person? What do you think of this person? And if they know them and they think highly, then I would ask for a personal introduction. VCs get bombed with cold emails all the time. I'm an LP in a fund out of the Bay Area called TNT Ventures, and on their website, they don't even have a contact us page. It says, if you want to get in touch with us, get an introduction from one of the founders that we support. I think that one might be a little bit too far on the unreachable spectrum, for my opinion. But at the same time, this is a 2-person fund, and VCs are very small companies. They don't have an infinite amount of resources. There's not a secretary sitting up front at a small seed stage fund taking the calls and screening the messages. So personal introductions are critically valuable. The second area where I've connected with a lot of amazing investors is, one of my hobbies is to write about the industry. This really started when I was running startups. I found that, that college and high school writing experience really transferred well into writing articulate blog posts. And my blog posts would generally outperform a lot of the other blog posts that were generated by other people on our team. And so when I started investing and advising in startups, one of the value adds that I would offer them is, hey, I'll do a blog post for you each year. That cascaded into me having a lot of really definitive points of view on the industry. So the last 3 years, I've written end of the year kind of predictions article for emerging technologies and companies that I'm seeing that may make a splash in the coming year. And every year, without fail, I post that thing around New Year's Eve or New Year's Day. And within the first couple of weeks, I get so many interesting connections through investors and founders, because like likes like. If I like Anshu and Anshu likes you, Nick, the chances of me liking you are very, very high. So by triangulating these networks through personal introductions and then, kind of putting your thoughts out there, putting yourself out there on social media, or writing blog posts or getting published in, FreightWaves or Journal of Commerce or something like this, those are ways that you can attract investors to come into you. And then the third area that I think is most underrated by people is you can attract investors and build deep relationships by being willing to help them. So to Anshu's point, these people need to access and reach out to people like us that are experts in this industry that aren't out there writing checks, right? So if an investor, Anshu and I have actually both, we've been contacted by the same investor about the same project before, where, one investor was looking at something in the space and they know Anshu, they know me, and we're generally willing to share our time and our advice for free. And that's exactly what the VCs need. It goes back to the fact that they're a small company. They raise money from large institutions and high net worth individuals to deploy that capital. They don't raise money to pay for opinions. They need to generate those opinions and synthesize them from their network. So if you're trying to build your brand and build your network in the VC space, the number one thing you can do is to say yes when they ask you for help.
Interesting. I like a lot that you mentioned the writing thing, because again, like we do something very similar. I put out blog posts and we get a really good response from them. And it's also funny how writing stuff actually helps you like figure out your own views on things a little bit better and helps you educate yourself. I'm a big fan of writing things. Totally different subject though. I'm going to switch gears a little bit here. So Charley, do investors consider startups' marketing strategies or lack thereof when making investments? Is that something that investors look at?
So I think this is relatively stage specific. Most of my investing career and where I spend most of my time is in the earliest of the early stages. So we're talking, a founder with a good idea, all the way through maybe like they've got a working product, they're starting to build their team, and maybe they've raised a little bit of venture capital. So starting on the earliest stage, if somebody's marketing is really buttoned up, but they don't have any customers yet, I think that could be a little bit of a red flag, because you have to ask yourself, like, are you putting the cart before the horse, or are you like building something that's going to solve a problem, or is this a problem that nobody has? So I think, as an early stage investor, you really have to blur your eyes a little bit and look at the founder and the space. And what I ask myself is, in my selling days, could I get excited about this solution? Like, that tells me there's a big market and I could sell it. And do I like this founder, and do I want to be their friend for the next 10 years? So that's on the earliest stage. It's very simple, those two questions. Do they have the right team? Are they chasing the right trend? If yes, then put the money in. As they evolve, I think investors do care about marketing, because there's a lot of guys out there and companies out there that raise money and they have a shitty brand. And as an investor, that would be a little bit of a red flag to me, right? Like, hey, you just took in $3.5 million in a seed round, but you haven't changed your logo or your website. Like, how attuned are you to the connection between your brand strength and your commercial strength? So I think depending on the stage, yes, absolutely, investors care about marketing. And then the last point is going back to the presentation. I've seen poor presentations kill great fundraising, experiences. So, if somebody has raised a little bit of money and they don't have a well-developed presentation, that could be a huge red flag as well.
Okay. Anshu, I saw you nodding at some point in there, so I'll kick the same question over to you. A company's marketing strategy, is that important to investors? Is it stage specific? What's your take on that? Oh, we might have lost Anshu though.
We lost Anshu.
We were so good for a while there. Well, we'll see if he pops back in. In the meantime, we'll roll into some other things. So, here he comes.
Sorry about that, guys.
Wouldn't be a webinar without some tech issues. Anyway, so I was going to throw the same question over to you, because I saw you nodding at some point during that. A company's marketing strategy, is that important to investors? Is it stage specific, like Charley was talking about? Do you have any take on that?
Yeah, couldn't agree more with Charley about the stage specificity, and particularly early on at the seed or the pre-seed stage. One of our investors gave me this line that I still quote, which is, the whale who spouts first gets harpooned. You're not sitting here trying to make noise yet. You haven't done anything yet, right? You've just gotten the idea. You get the band together. We're investing in the team. We're investing in the concept, like Charley outlined, and we think this could be a big company, but it's the 0 to 1 phase. Get sort of that initial traction established, and then let's talk about how we get that message out. But certainly as you get further down the path, when it's about repeatability, when you want to prove that sort of early team that came together and sacrificed whatever they needed to kind of get that initial concept out into the market, can now that be repeated, right? Was it just about the broken clock being right twice a day? Or no, there's something here that can be repeated. And then later on, when we're trying to get the message out more broadly in growth stage to a set of not just customers and prospects, but partners, investors, just a broader community to start to build some groundswell. Well, in that case, that scalability is going to require a different level of marketing sophistication. But, going back to that early stage, and as Charley also outlined, getting that point, that focus that you're going to have as crisply and clearly articulated as possible, that's it. That's probably where I draw the lines for what marketing an early stage investor is looking for. Can you tell me why this thing matters and why this is going to change the world? please stop talking after that. And then later on, you've earned the right to perhaps tell a little bit more about where this goes. If you're successful, what's the second act, and all those wonderful things that you might have thought about. But if you just brain dump all of that up at the beginning, you'll actually, frankly, I think, lose credibility.
Okay. So as the process goes on, as you make your way through these stages, do you find that there's sometimes a mismatch between the marketing and the actual product or service?
Yeah, I'll just say
as an example.
Yeah, to be honest, I think if you're not finding mismatches as you're growing really fast, you're probably doing it wrong. I mean, there's going to be mismatches all along the way. And I think the hard question becomes which mismatches are really important to address. So if you're kind of getting from, you've delivered something as a product into the world that is finding resonance with a few key customers, it was hard to do that. How do you take that story to the earlier conversation out to a few more folks in the most efficient manner, i.e. build enough of the marketing discipline to be able to do that well? And then from there, there's other disciplines that need to be brought in. It's pretty rare to kind of be able to think all of that through together and frankly have the skill sets to do all of those things well when you run into that particular need as you start to grow a company fast. So I think mismatches are sort of the name of the game, but to be transparent about it, you're going to have those on the technology side, you're going to have that on the go-to-market side. That's just one of the consequences, I think, of having to grow fast and keep pace with, rising demand.
Okay. Charley, what about you? Mismatches between marketing and the actual product or service?
I just love what Anshu said about if you're not creating mismatches in your business, you're doing something wrong. And I'll put a little bit of a finer point on that. Your role as the founder of a startup company is not to build what you want to build. You need to solve a problem that people actually have. And a lot of times that problem moves around. In fact, it always does. And so, I think the worst startup founders are the ones that stay convicted to that initial vision that they had, because that just demonstrates they're not listening to the market 100%. So I love it when I see a startup that's, running all the way down the path on path Y, but their website is still saying X, because to me, that just demonstrates that they're iterating faster than they are stopping to change things. And so, there's these certain foundational elements of your project that you kind of need to stay convicted to, but exactly what that solution is and what that delivery is, that is not up to you. That's up to the market, because it doesn't matter if you're first or wrong, or if you're too early or you're wrong, it's still the same outcome, right? So you need to really stay attuned to what the market is asking you for and let the market guide your approach. And that's really where value is created. So, I think there's a difference between, misleading people or telling the fundamental wrong story or using terrible words, that aren't accurately describing your business. That's different. What I'm talking about is you start a project with an initial thesis, and then the metamorphosis of that initial thesis over the period of time. I like it when those mismatches are created, because that's showing that the founder is paying attention to what the customer is saying, and they're not spending every day looking at their website.
That's not where I thought you guys were going to go with this question, but I like it a lot better. So great job, everybody. That was incredibly interesting, actually. So given today's market with the investment environment changing a little bit, do you see the importance of marketing changing at all? I guess either of you. Anshu.
I think so. I'm not quite sure exactly how marketing needs to adapt to changing environments and conditions. To be fair, I'm not sure which way is up right now in terms of the whole macro picture. But I think just to be humble in the face of this uncertainty, if we're not expecting to have to course correct or adjust some of the messaging. I mean, one specific example, customers that we've been working with for the past couple of years are feeling very uncertain about their own company's health going into these couple quarters. And so if you're not, to Charley's point, empathetic and providing a listening ear to what's keeping your customer up at night, and you're still out there with the same marketing message, say, wow, we're going to keep growing at 10x and then 10x again. And meanwhile, they're wondering if the wheels are going to come off the bus in their business. You're talking past each other. You might actually be losing some of that trust you've built over the last few years. So yes, I do think marketing needs to change. Exactly how that manifests, I think the first thing that we're most focused on is active listening. What are customers actually experiencing? What is the way that the problems that they experience on a day-to-day basis, showing up in their supply chain and transportation, where we might be able to do something to help? So if we can be actively listening, looking for and picking our spots to be helpful, hopefully we double down on the trust we've built. Otherwise, we could be a little tone deaf, fast growing company, while some folks are kind of wondering if they're going to make it through this particular turn in the cycle.
No, that's interesting. I have a follow-up question to that, but first, Charley, what's your take on if marketing needs to change given kind of the changing market conditions?
Well, I would say first off, like a year ago, even 6 months ago, there was this sort of environment where if a startup was in a big space, the founder had some credibility, they were going to get money, period, end of story. You're seeing now that the processes are becoming more vigilant, and diligence really means diligence. A year ago, diligence was taking place in the first board meeting because it was so competitive and investors had to put money in to take you off the market. So 6 months ago, I was hearing, hey, I want to raise $2 million on 10 million post money. I'm willing to sell 20% of the company. The guy takes a few VC calls. Next thing you know, he's saying, hey, sounds like I'm going to be raising 5 at 25. And there was a line of people that were oversubscribed, and VCs were just cramming money into these companies, because if you said you were going to be at a certain place in 6 months, VCs were willing to say, hey, let's take a meeting to show me how you're going to get there in 6 months. And maybe I'll just give you that valuation that you're going to be at in 6 months to get you off the market and get some capital to work. Clearly, things have changed. So I think if you go back to the basic elements of marketing, which is really to develop a pipeline or a funnel, I think that element of marketing is critically important now more than ever in this environment, because the VCs have a lot of the power that they didn't have a short period of time ago. So I'm encouraging founders to spend more time researching prospective VCs, developing the pipeline, identifying meaningful contacts and ways that they can be introduced to these VCs. And then, I'm also, I just got off the phone with a person who unfortunately is caught up in some of these layoffs, or will be caught up in some of these layoffs that you're seeing in the industry right now. And he's an executive at an early stage company. And he's saying, hey, maybe it's my time to go start something. And my conversation with him was very much around the early elements of marketing for his project. It's like, hey, so you've got an idea. That's great. You need to reduce it to writing first. Put it into a memo form. Write 2 pages about this. Circulate it to your network, to people that you know and trust. Get some feedback and validation on the viability of the project. Get some input from people who have been through the process. Then build your presentation deck. And these were steps that, frankly, Nick, weren't required over the last few years. And I don't think we're going to be in a prolonged market contraction like we were when the economy took a dive in 2007 and venture didn't wake back up until 2013. I don't think this is going to be that deep, but who am I to know? But I do think it's more important for founders to develop their ideas and their messaging and make it more clear, because you're probably just going to get fewer at-bats with these VCs than you would have 6-8 months ago.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So in terms of kind of a related question to that, looking at it from the other perspective, how do investors use marketing to attract new startups or new companies to invest in? Is that part of the process, or is it just so skewed the other direction that investors don't need to do that?
I don't know, Charley, you probably have more perspective on this.
I think, investment is a very niche space, right? There's generalist investors that want to be more attractive to startups, but each type of investor has its own unique asset class that they generally like to spend their time investing in based on the parameters of their funds. So I think the marketing that investors do, Anshu, you probably have the same thing. I probably get 100 VC monthly update emails, and none of them add value to me. Like, it's very, very rare that I get one of these emails from these investors that I even open anymore. But I feel like they all feel like they need to be pushing out a newsletter just to be relevant. So in my mind, like, the guerrilla marketing of social media, events, PR, like, that's the most effective marketing as an investor to attract potential prospects, because founders are busy as anybody, and they're not opening newsletters, or at least I wasn't as a founder. I was never sitting there reading some investor's newsletter. But when I can't sleep at night because I'm worried about what's going to come the next day, I am scrolling through Twitter, and I am kind of looking for investors that are looking for something like what I'm building. So I really like the grassroots and the guerrilla marketing. And I also think, this plays on the other side. As an early stage startup, you don't have 10 or 15,000 bucks a month to put a really great marketing firm on retainer, but you do have a little extra time to write something. You can get that article published in one of the publications, or more importantly, if you have a big milestone or you achieve something meaningful, rather than pushing it out through the PR newswire and just kind of pushing out some garbage update, I think the founders that exercise guerrilla marketing the best find a way to get their interesting milestones written about in the major trade publications. And that PR creates meaningful inbound on customers, on investors, and on new employees. So I think guerrilla marketing at the early stage is really my favorite kind of marketing. And that doesn't mean you do it all on your own. I mean, you should work with professionals on developing the right collateral and the right messaging. But it demonstrates a level of hustle, both on the VC side and the founder side, that's attractive to both.
Yeah, I think the only thing I'd add to that is, the personalized emails when a prospective investor has taken the time to really think about what we're doing and why it could be a big deal, and why their thesis, the work that they've done, their previous experience, other portfolio investments, whatever led them to think that this would be of interest. That thoughtfulness, the few times where you've seen really well-crafted sort of inbound notes from folks, they've done their homework in advance. Well, this person is probably going to look at a problem because we're going to run into plenty of them along the way, and think about them just as hard. That tends to be a really great way, just from a founder's perspective, I think, to grab the attention of the founding team. Say, I'm sure you're up at night obsessing over your problem. What else would you be thinking about? Here I am sitting here thinking about it too, and builds a little bit of a bridge.
I think that's a great point.
No, I like that a lot. I think that's a good point. And we're at like the 15-20 minute mark, and this is where we usually transition to the next section here. So in the last section of these, we do like hot words or hot phrases, and I'm sure everyone in the industry knows some like buzzwords that get thrown around that kind of lose their intended meaning, or words that you just don't know because you're not as exposed to this particular part of the space. So during this section, I'm going to throw some like terms and words at you guys, and I'd like to get just a quick 1 minute take on what it means, what it should mean. And I'm just going to kick it off with Charley here. So venture capital versus private equity, what's the difference?
Super simple. Venture capital is generally reserved for the early stages of a company's evolution. There's not really clear milestone markers around how big you need to be before venture is no longer the right instrument. You move into private equity. But the biggest differentiator to kind of think about these is venture capitalists are taking moonshots. They're looking for businesses that are going to be incredibly valuable 10 plus years down the road. So that requires them to think differently, and they look at teams and trends. Private equity is super simple. they invest off of EBITDA. So a VC person will pay up to get and attract the most impressive founders that are tackling the largest problems. Private equity, it's a math equation. If you're spitting off cash and there's way to reduce that and there's way to grow the top line, private equity's all in on that. But on the VC side, they're investing long before profits are even part of the equation in most cases.
All right. That's more simple than I thought it was going to be. Anshu, we'll do the next one for you. And if there's one of these that you guys want to kick to the other person because it's a better fit, just let me know. But Anshu, accelerator versus an incubator. What's the difference between those?
I mean, that really is a layup for Charley, but
we can kick over him if you want.
I would say an incubator is really focused on gestating those early ideas. An accelerator, there's some momentum, some traction established, and you want to literally grow that and accelerate that. That's the way I think about the difference. But Charley, you're definitely the expert here.
Yeah, at ZEBOX, there's no I searched very hard for the definition and the delineation between the two when I first took this job. And in absence of a better idea, I just made up my own. So the way we look at acceleration and incubation is, number one, in ZEBOX America, we don't need to incubate companies. There's already this great market of robust startups that are already commercially ready to meet the needs of our partners. But on a case-by-case basis, we will take incubation candidates if their project is so ambitious and their team is so talented that we believe they're going to make a meaningful difference. So the way we define those is an accelerator is for a company that has a viable product, they've got a well-developed team, and they've already capitalized the business for success. In absence of those three things, the company would need to be looking for an incubation program that can help them attract the right team, develop or prototype their MVP, and then get the capital that they need to advance the project.
Got it. That makes way more sense to me than it did 10 minutes ago. All right, Anshu, the next one, Charley just said it, but MVP. What does MVP mean to you?
Minimum viable product. And the hardest part is figuring out minimum, right? And particularly when you've got people who have a lot of thought and experience and scar tissue from living the problem, or have technical and analytical expertise, and they really want to build something more robust. But what is the minimum it's going to take to prove that you've been able to meaningfully solve the problem differently? That's your MVP. And really focusing in on making that as sparse as possible is, I think, the art.
Charley, I see you nodding along. Do you have anything to add to that one?
So the only thing I want to add is I encourage founders about this all the time is your minimum viable product does not need technology or software. Some of the most promising startups that I'm involved with right now, the founders, when I first met them, thought they needed $500K to build an app. And really what they needed was a clickable prototype that they made over the week on an vision. And one founder in particular, who Anshu does some business with, Taylor at Basic Block. When I first met this kid 4 years ago in a coffee shop, he was looking to raise $500K. And I was like, man, you need that. You need a hole in the head. You're just going to go out and blow that money building the Winchester mystery house of apps, right? So what I encouraged Taylor to do, and what he did to get his project off the ground, is he made a clickable prototype with his co-founder over the weekend. Taylor locked himself in the room. And a clickable prototype, just so you know, is maybe one step more advanced than a PowerPoint presentation. You can make something that looks and feels like a technology platform, and you can click on a button and it'll open another screen. So in some ways, it kind of looks like you made software. But Taylor took that clickable prototype and he sold $60,000 worth of licenses to trucking companies that prepaid him to build his app. So I think people get lost in trying to build software as their MVP, but an MVP could be something as simple as a process or some methodology that you can build into a spreadsheet.
That's a super interesting take on it. I love the example too. What about, Charley, what about go-to-market strategy?
Go-to-market strategy is get off your ass and go sell your product. So there's a lot of nuances around that can be tweaked and changed as you become more experienced. But go-to-market strategy to me means, hey, what's the problem you're solving? What's the product you're delivering? To do that, who do you need to sell it to, and how are you going to reach them? And then of course within that is, packaging, pricing, and all these other things. But really, go-to-market strategy means get out there and go do it.
That's the best description of go-to-market strategy that I've heard so far. Like the entire webinar is worth it just for that one. Anshu, product market fit. What does that mean?
Yeah, that's one which gets thrown around a lot. But I think to Charlie's point, you need to know what to go out and sell, right? So what is this particular thing that you're selling that your customer can't live without? If you've got something like that, where the customer is saying, look, if you unplug this thing, I'll be upset, you probably have the beginnings of product market fit. And then you can think about the suite of products, and there's lots of work on product that you can do. And we, certainly are continuing to do at Leaf. But that initial sort of, hey, I've delivered something that has 10x impact, and the customer saying, please don't take it away. That seems to be the simplest sort of litmus test for me.
Okay. So I got a couple more that I feel are a little bit buzzwordy. The first one, like Charley, is pivot. To me, sometimes it feels like people say pivot just to mean that they screwed something up and they're changing. What does pivot actually mean?
So the first misconception is that pivots are on purpose. Like they don't have to be. Like it goes back to, if you're not changing your mission based on the customer's voice, and you're not creating this misalignment with your old marketing messaging and your new product offering, then you're not doing something right. So to me, is a pivot can be something as simple as I was out there and I was talking to 5 customers, and the first customer that told me this little piece of feedback, that was interesting. The second one that told me the same thing, that wasn't a coincidence, that was a trend. So the second you hear validation of an idea that you've already heard, it's time to kind of start going in that direction. So most of the time, your journey to success is not linear, and it also doesn't look like stairs. It's like this winding, curvy path. And a pivot is that small change or tweak that you make. Sometimes it's a big change because maybe you did mess something up or you spent too long going down the wrong rabbit hole. But pivots are not a bad thing, and they're not a good thing. They just happen.
So this is kind of a related one, I guess. I hear the word iterate thrown around a lot. What does iterate mean?
So, piggybacking on the minimum viable product idea, you've obviously done the minimum required. So if you're not continuously working that particular solution, or you're not working on other ideas and experiments that you've run, and learning from and course correcting, then you're probably missing something, right? If you've already developed the right answer and the world just has to catch up to you, that seems like a dangerous place to be. So the idea that you're constantly out there tweaking, adjusting, iterating, it very much is about trial and error and experimentation, but very disciplined, right? You're getting this sort of capital to put to work to experiment, but experiment with a purpose. What are you learning from that, and how are you going to iterate from whatever you learned in the last step? Iterate, I think, is an important word. Unfortunately, a buzzword that I think we can't do without right now.
You're probably right. We'll have this. This will be our last one. Charley, scalability. What does scalability mean?
Scalability comes down to the idea that what you've been doing up to a certain point needs to be perfected or iterated on to get to a place where it can be repeated at a higher volume and a higher velocity. So what was good enough to get you to one phase of your startup is not going to be good enough to get you to the next level. So generally, scalability requires certainly product market fit. It certainly requires access to capital to be able to reach new heights and reach new areas. But most importantly, it really comes down to great systems and processes to allow you to repeat what you're doing over and over and over again. So when I started my first company, it was a freight brokerage company. And I'll never forget when my brother and I hit our first 10 load day. And we thought, holy cow, like we went home beat up that day after getting 10 loads. And I remember thinking to myself, how do companies ever get to thousands of loads? And what I was missing early in my career was the systems and the processes and the people that could do what I was doing at a much higher velocity and higher volume.
Yeah. Anshu, I see you nodding. Anything to add to that one?
No, I mean, I think the plug for technology there is it's supposed to be used for that type of purpose. But if you haven't figured out the process and the repeatable motion, to Charlie's point, you could Band-Aid a lot of bad process and make them go faster. That doesn't actually mean that's a good application of technology. So the process and the repeatability before you get to scalability seems to be, logically the process that most people follow.
And I just want to add one more point here, because I think scalability is something that people aim for far too early in many startups, because the reality is you can do things that are not scalable for a very long period of time, especially with the right amount of venture capital. The most valuable thing you can do is exactly what the customer wants you to do, and you can validate that again and again, then scale that. But one thing I hear from startups, like when I was a startup founder and now that I coach startups all the time, is there's always somebody in there going, well, this doesn't scale, or when we scale, we can't do this anymore. And it's like, just shut up. Don't worry about that until you need to worry about that. Because at the moment, you're still fighting to survive. The most important thing for you is not to die tomorrow. And if you have to do something that's not scalable, that's absolutely what you do, because most businesses in the world are not scalable. The trick as a venture-backed founder is to find a path to scalability, but it generally comes much later than most people think.
I think that's amazing advice. It's a great note to end on. So we're going to wrap it up there. Everybody, thanks for joining us today. Charley, Anshu, thanks a ton for jumping on here. I think it was a great conversation. If people like the conversation, share the episode, like it, do anything you can to put it out there. If you have additional questions that we didn't cover today, Charley, how do you reach out? How does somebody reach out?
At Charley Dehoney on Twitter. You can Google my name. I'm pretty easy to find.
All right. And Anshu, how does someone reach out to you?
Anshu.Prasad at Leaf Logistics. Love to hear from you.
Perfect. That's all we got. Thanks again for jumping on. And Charley, Anshu, thanks for being a part of this.
Thanks,
Appreciate
everybody.
Thanks, Nick.